27. The artist, deaf and mute, had been my childhood friend, and it was he who taught me how to sign, and it was from him that I found the inspiration to become a poet, an artist of language, as he was an artist of imagery. We had remained close up until the time of my unhappy marriage, and after my divorce I visited him infrequently. I had been so emotionally drained and defiled from personal torment that I became extremely reclusive, remaining alone after returning home each work-day from my secretarial duties. When at last I began to work on a new collection of verse, I experienced a longing for artistic companionship, and so I made my way to Philip's small house and pushed the doorbell. The live-in housekeeper/cook answered my summons, and led me to the wide ladder stepway that took one to the upper attic rooms where my friend did most of his work. I found him sitting before a canvas in bright electric light, and that puzzled me, as it had always been Philip's habit to paint in candlelight. We signed our greetings as I pulled a chair next to his, and took his hands in mine, and then I studied the painting on which he was employed. It was a night scene, but one so exceptional that I was instantly captivated. The main image was that of a titanic three-sided lighthouse, erected on an expanse of large flat rocks that spread as far as eye could see. No body of water was in sight. A full moon shot one solid beam of light to the top of the tower that contained the lantern-room, although the lighthouse itself was entirely dark. What struck me so powerfully about the work was the combination of effects that the image evoked. The plain of large flat stones, the moon and the myriad pinpoints of stars looked entirely realistic, but the structure itself contained a quality of otherworldliness that perplexed me. It was like some fabled construction of biblical myth that had usurped a location in historic fact. Philip turned to study my reaction to his work. "It's strange and effective," I told him as he watched my mouth. "Wherever did you come up with the conception?" How odd, his timid smile. "I saw it in a dream," he signed as I held his hands, and as I clasped him I thought I detected a slight trembling of those hands, as if he had been moved by queer emotion. And then the especially weird occurrence took place. I heard a most peculiar sound outside the small attic window. How can I describe it? It began as a high-pitched ringing sensation deep inside my skull that grew in depth of sound and transitioned itself to some place within the gulf of night outside the window. It then deepened into a kind of low moan, not unlike wind, or whispering, and within its sound one could almost detect an idiotic alien summons. Something in the unfathomable sound of it stabbed like splinters in my skull, and I cried out in dismay. I turned to Philip to see if he had detected my alarm, although he obviously would not have heard my cry, and I grew cold with a kind of fear, when I saw that he was staring at the attic window with an odd expression on his face, an aspect of listening. Rising, I released his tight hands and walked to the small attic window, which I opened. Cool air brushed my face as I stared into dark heaven, and at first I could not understand what I imagined was before me, a void of illimitable blackness that contained a kind of undulation, as if I stared at waves of liquid sea that moved from me toward cosmic nothingness. Sensing Philip at my side, I turned to gawk at him, and although his face was at first extremely serious, he slowly forced a smile and leaned so as to kiss my face. Then he turned to peer out of the attic window, and when I followed his gaze, I saw that there was a moon and myriad stars. That was the last time I saw my friend. The occurrence of his mysterious disappearance caused much talk in our circle of Bohemia, especially when it was learned that he had left a list of instructions in which I was bequeathed his final painting. That these instructions had been legally arranged suggested that he knew he would be disappearing, and many expected to find his body in some lake or isolated location. But his escape from the world was absolute, and he was never found. I arrived at his home, which had been left to his faithful companion, and she presented me with the large canvas, which had been wrapped with sturdy paper and twine. I was surprised, upon returning home and removing that which covered it, to find that what I had was either an alternative painting of the same scene, or a reworking of the original canvas. It was identical in many ways, except for the moon, which was now a decayed grey globe, and the lighthouse was no longer dark, but illuminated with a kind of black-violet light that oozed from the lens of the lantern-room into space, toward the dead lunar sphere. All starlight had extinguished. As I studied the image, I was overwhelmed with a feeling of intense loneliness, and with a futility toward all aspects of reality. It was a depressing work, and it made my brain cold with a kind of horror for mortal existence. I was overwhelmed with a longing for escape, for some way to vanish as completely as Philip had. I hung the painting that night over my bedpost. It had snowed that day and my apartment was chilly. It is my habit to sleep in the nude. I liked the feel of flesh against flesh, my legs wrapped around one another, my hands at breast or thigh. I went to my closet and found the heavy eiderdown that I kept there for chilly winter nights, and thus I was fairly comfortable when at last I retired. But it was a sharp chilliness that awakened me, and I could not understand why no blankets covered me. I felt cold terror when, gazing upward, I did not see bedroom ceiling, but rather an expanse of midnight sky in which a cold moon gleamed. I pushed myself to a sitting position on the large sheet of rock on which I had reclined, and shivered in the wintry wind that assaulted my nakedness. The triangular tower of stone tilted above me, and out of its pharos there shone a blurred beam of dark radiance. Rising, I walked along the rocks to the tower's archway and crossed the threshold, into a place of ice-cold basalt. I climbed the many steps of smooth stone that took me to the top, where my nakedness was bathed in eerie anti-light. The sentient radiance moved in circular fashion, like some revolving behemoth eye, and the pulsing beam of black light shot out toward the moon. I stepped out onto the circular balcony, and was surprised to find no metal lattice to keep me from falling to the rocks below. I gazed outward as the moon began to decay in the outer darkness, and as I beheld that dying globe I felt an uncanny need to touch it. Thus I reached out, stepping into the path of black and violet illumination that beamed toward the decrepit globe. I walked into the ether, toward the dying moon, as cosmic mistral frolicked with my hair and encased my mortal nakedness. The blackness all around me began to ripple like waves of an ocean, and I smiled as this nameless undulation washed me outward, toward an infinity of naught. 28. He left his apartment at around 20 minutes to midnight on August the 29th, with a yellowed newspaper cutting in his hand. It was his hope that most of the Caucasians that inhabited the section of the metropolis where he had found a hotel would be inside at so late an hour, for he had grown to hate the suspicious glances from their pallid faces when they noticed him, and he loathed the way they infested the sidewalks, oozing like puffy pale maggots as they chattered in high nasal tones. Thus he rushed beneath the bright windows of occupied buildings that were hideous in their modernity, and he scowled at the bleating voices and obnoxious contemporary noise that was the music of the age that squeezed from out those windows and maddened him. He had rushed quickly and was soon breathless, and so he finally ceased his scurrying and leaned beneath one antique lamp-post that looked different from the ones that illuminated the populated places, and as he calmed his lungs he brought the cutting to the light and examined it anew. It was because of the article he had found in the old newspaper, and more specifically the accompanying photograph, that he had come to the city. for in the photograph he saw a thing that had visited him in his most fantastic dreams. A statue carved of dark wood that resembled a bestial black goddess, a loathsome thing of Africa. In his fantastic dreams he was one among a throng of the very old folk that worshipped this effigy of twilight, and it astounded him to discover, quite by accident in the bookshop where he was employed, a page of newspaper that had lined a box of books that were part of a dead man's library, the image from his midnight dreams. The books in the box were decades old and of little value, and he had been bored to death as he plucked them from the box and listed them in his notebook, and he had barely noticed the folded sheet of newsprint at the bottom of the box until its photograph seized his attention. He read the article that spoke of the old abandoned section of a city, and of its courtyard where a mysterious pagan statue stood like some icon of secret myth. Thus he had come to the ugly modern city, determined to discover its neglected older corners and the courtyard with the aid of a street map. As he leaned against the lamp-post the midnight air was graced with a soft, low sound. A bell was tolling in the centuried church he could dimly see in the distance, and the genteel pealing helped to take him away from the neoteric clamour of the city and its plastic inhabitants. He followed the sound into the shadowed confines of the older section, where he was suddenly overwhelmed with a sense of keen expectancy, for he felt that another world was opening before him, an elder realm of old wood, tainted by strange sunsets and ghastly moonfire, where one could encounter neglected deities, forgotten gods. Paved sidewalks were replaced by cobblestone that led him, at last, to the arched threshold and the sacred place beyond it. Lured, he stepped into an older shadow and breathed another air that was fragrant with spice and marvel. And in that air he thought he could detect half-heard songs that were a paean of rapture that called the thing, darkly divine, whose worship had elapsed, the thing whose idol was suddenly before him. He knelt below the hoary figure of a goddess carved of obsidian, and ached to chant the half-heard mantra that haunted his skull. He breathed the alien language and drifted into an incorporeal place disembodied from mundane reality. The hand that stroked his hair was as smooth as polished marble, and as chilly. Taking that hand in his, he kissed it, yet as he stood to drink in her spectral beauty, his eyes were burned by the awful whiteness of the moon above them. He stared at her with prayerful eyes, and so she turned from him and moved a hand into distant air, forming a rift in reality beyond which he could see the others of his ancestral kin, the strange dark folk who hungered to dance around their goddess. Taking his hand, she led him through the threshold of dream, into which, happily, there would be no return.